The wind howled against the thin walls of the shack, a mournful sound that crept through every crack and knothole. Inside, the air was colder than the snow outside. The fire had long gone out, leaving behind only a faint curl of ash that stirred when the wind slipped under the door. Clara Monroe sat on the floor beside a dented tin plate, her hands red from the cold. Two small figures huddled under a ragged quilt beside her, Ella, her daughter of 8 years, and Tommy, her son, barely 5. Their cheeks were hollow, their lips chapped, and yet they tried to smile. Dinner was what remained of a charity meal from 3 days ago. Cold beans and a crust of bread so hard Clara had to soak it in a cup of water to make it chewable. The children didn't complain. They had learned not to. Ella carefully divided the beans, making sure her brother got the larger portion, as Clara pretended not to notice. The girl's small act of selflessness was something her mother both admired and feared. Kindness like that didn't survive long in a world that showed them none. Clara watched the two eat, pretending to nibble at her own share. In truth, she hadn't eaten since dawn. Hunger had become an old, familiar ache in her body, dull, constant, easier to ignore than her children's hollow eyes. When they finished, Ella looked up with a brave little smile. "It was good, Mama," she whispered. Tommy nodded sleepily, already half asleep on his sister's shoulder. Clara reached out and brushed a strand of hair from his face. Her hand trembled. "Good night, my loves," she said softly, tucking the thin blanket tighter around them. When they finally drifted off, she stayed awake, staring at the small window that rattled in its frame. The stars beyond it looked cruelly bright, sharp against the dark sky, as if the heavens themselves were watching her fail. It hadn't always been like this. A year ago, she'd had a husband, Jack Monroe, a good man with laughter in his voice and calluses on his hands. He worked on the cattle drive that came through every spring, always promising to buy them a small place of their own someday. But last spring, a storm hit the herd, and Jack never came home. They said he was trampled trying to save another rider. No one even brought back his body. After that, everything began to fall apart. The landlord took their cabin. The neighbors stopped calling. Work dried up, and when word spread that she was cursed, that every man who helped her met some ill fate, even the kind ones turned away. Now, there was nothing left but this shack, borrowed from an old trapper who hadn't returned in years, and the will to keep her children alive one more day. The wind pressed harder against the walls, making them groan. Clara pulled her shawl tighter and moved to the window, wiping away frost with her sleeve. The town lay silent in the distance, a handful of dim lanterns flickering along Main Street. Somewhere out there, people were laughing inside warm houses, eating real food, living real lives. For a moment, she closed her eyes and let the tears come. She didn't sob, not anymore. Just tears that froze before they could fall. "Please," she whispered into the darkness. "Just one more chance." The wind didn't answer, but far off, carried faintly through the snow, came the echo of hooves. A rider on the road heading toward town. She didn't know it yet, but that sound was the beginning of everything. The morning after that long, frozen night, Luke Callahan rode into the town of Dry Creek, his horse's hooves crunching through a thin layer of snow that sparkled beneath a pale sun. The air carried the bite of winter and the scent of wood smoke from a few distant chimneys. Luke was a man who'd seen many winters on the plains. He wore them like a second skin. His broad shoulders were dusted with snowflakes, his hat tilted low against the wind. He rode with the slow confidence of someone who knew both his land and himself. Luke wasn't one for crowds, but duty had brought him to town, a delivery of cattle to the railhead and supplies for the ranch before the next storm rolled in. The men at the stockyard greeted him with the usual nods and respect. For everyone in Dry Creek knew Luke Callahan, the man who ran the Circle C Ranch, one of the last standing after the drought and floods that had broken others. He was known for his fairness, his quiet strength, and the rare kindness that didn't need words to prove itself. Inside the mercantile, Luke exchanged a few words with Mr. Bailey, the storekeeper, about grain and tools. His voice was low, steady, the kind that didn't carry emotion but always carried weight. He was counting out coins when something outside caught his eye. Two small children crouched near a stack of crates, their hands cupped around a pitiful little fire made from scraps of paper and splinters. They were trying to warm themselves against the morning frost. Luke watched for a long moment. The girl, maybe 8 years old, was pulling her brother's coat tighter around him. The boy's cheeks were red from cold, his nose running, but he didn't cry. There was something proud in the way they sat, pretending not to be miserable, pretending not to notice people passing by. "Monroe's kids," Bailey muttered behind the counter, following Luke's gaze. "The widow and her young'uns. Poor thing's been struggling since Jack died. Folks tried to help, but she don't take charity kindly." Luke turned slowly. "Clara Monroe?" Bailey nodded. "That's her. Pretty woman once. Still is, if you can look past what life's done to her. Lives out past Miller's Creek in that old trapper's shack. Shame, really. She's got more pride than sense. I heard her boy was sick last week. Doctor says they ain't got money for medicine." Luke didn't reply. He just looked out the window again. The girl was now helping her brother stand. They were about to walk away, small figures swallowed by snow and silence. Something stirred in him. Not pity, but recognition. He'd been that boy once, cold, hungry, pretending to be fine. He remembered a winter like this, long ago, before his father died. He remembered knocking on doors and being turned away. And he remembered the one man who didn't turn him away, an old drifter who'd shared his fire and taught him that a cowboy's worth wasn't measured by his land, but by how he treated those who had none. Luke stepped outside, tightening his coat against the wind. The snow had started again, soft but steady. He walked toward his horse, watching the children vanish around the corner toward the edge of town. He didn't follow, not yet, but the sight of them lingered in his chest like a burr he couldn't shake. He finished his errands, loaded the wagon, and mounted his horse again. But instead of turning back toward his ranch, his hands tugged the reins the other way, toward the creek road, toward the widow's shack. The decision wasn't made with thought, only with instinct. The wind rose behind him, cold and sharp, but Luke barely felt it. Somewhere ahead, a woman and two children were fighting to survive the same storm he'd once known, and this time, he wasn't going to ride past. By the time Luke Callahan reached the edge of Miller's Creek, the sun had begun to sink, turning the snowfields a bruised shade of gray-blue. His horse's breath came in plumes of white mist, and the rhythmic creak of saddle leather was the only sound for miles. He knew the road well. Most folks avoided this part of the valley, saying it brought bad luck. But Luke didn't believe in curses. He believed in what he could see, and right now, all he saw was a family trying to survive what no one should face alone. A thin trail of smoke rose from the crooked roof of a shack ahead, barely visible through the drifts. The place looked abandoned. The fence sagged, the door hung crooked, and the small window glowed with the faintest hint of light. Luke slowed his horse, dismounted, and led it to a tree, his boots crunching through the frost. As he approached, he caught the faintest sound, a woman's voice, soft but tired, humming a lullaby to quiet the children. He moved closer to the window, careful not to startle anyone. Through the frosted glass, he could see the widow and her children gathered around a small plate on the table. The same cold beans he'd seen the kids trying to warm earlier that day. Clara sat between them, her posture straight despite the exhaustion that hung from her shoulders. She broke the food into 3 small portions and handed the largest to her son. Her hands trembled as she passed the plate, but her face was composed, calm, brave, motherly. Luke felt something twist deep in his chest. He'd seen men die on cattle drives, seen hunger and hardship, but this was different. There was a kind of dignity in her suffering, a refusal to yield that made the sight unbearable. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply endured. The boy took a bite and smiled sleepily, whispering something to his sister that made her giggle. Even through the thin glass, the sound carried, a small, fragile laugh in a world that had forgotten laughter. Clara reached over, brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead, and smiled too. The look on her face wasn't joy exactly. It was love, fierce and quiet, the kind that fought against despair with nothing but its own strength. Luke stood there, motionless, the cold biting through his gloves. He remembered another winter long ago, his mother dying of fever, him sitting by the fire too afraid to move, too young to understand why she wouldn't wake. He remembered the days that followed, empty stomachs, empty house, empty sky. It was an ache he'd buried deep, but now, watching the widow feed her children, the memories rose like ghosts. He took off his hat, holding it in his hands. His breath came out slow, misting in the cold. This wasn't charity, he thought. This was right. This was what his father had meant when he said a man's measure was how far he'd ride to help another soul stand. Inside, the fire flickered once and went out. Clara rose from the table, wrapping her arms around both children, pulling them close under one blanket. Luke saw her glance toward the window, her eyes distant, lost in thought. He quickly stepped back into the shadows, not wanting to frighten her. He stood there for another long moment before turning toward his horse. The wind cut across the plain, harsh and cold, but Luke hardly noticed. He looked once more at the shack, then up at the wide, starless sky. "Not tonight," he murmured under his breath. "Not while I'm here." He mounted his horse and rode back toward town, the decision already set in his mind. Tomorrow, before the next storm, he would come back. Not as a stranger watching from the dark, but as a man who refused to let another go hungry again. The next morning broke pale and windless, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. A weak sun struggled to pierce through the gray clouds, spilling a faint, ghostly light over the snow-covered valley. Inside the shack, Clara Monroe stirred before her children did. Her fingers were stiff from the cold as she wrapped her shawl tighter and glanced at the small fire she'd managed to coax from the last of their wood. It wouldn't last an hour. She moved quietly, trying not to wake Ella or Tommy, and stood at the window to look out over the frozen hills. The world seemed empty. Nothing moved but the wind curling through the dry grass. She was about to turn away when, in the distance, she spotted a figure on horseback. A man, tall in the saddle, riding slow but steady along the trail toward her place. Her heart clenched. Strangers rarely came this far out. Within minutes, the rider drew close enough that she recognized him. The rancher she'd seen in town once or twice. Luke Callahan, the one folks spoke of in quiet tones. A man of few words and good reputation. He rode like he'd been born in the saddle, his long coat brushed with frost, his hat pulled low against the wind. Clara's first instinct was fear. She didn't know what he wanted. Maybe he was here to tell her to move off the trapper's land, or worse, to offer pity she couldn't bear to take. She straightened her back and opened the door before he could knock. Luke dismounted, removing his hat respectfully. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice low and calm. "Mr. Callahan," she replied, her tone cautious but polite. "You're a long way from your ranch." "I reckon I am," he said, glancing toward the shack, then at the children peeking from behind her skirts. "Saw your little ones yesterday near town?" They looked cold. "Thought I'd bring a bit of wood and food." Her eyes flicked to the small burlap sack in his hand. The smell of baked bread drifted through the air, warm, rich, almost unbearable in its kindness. For a heartbeat, she nearly reached for it. Then pride stiffened her spine. "I appreciate it," she said tightly, "but we're fine." Luke studied her face, saw the hollow beneath her eyes, the trembling in her fingers. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," he said gently, "but I reckon you're not." Clara's chin lifted. "We don't take charity." "Didn't say it was charity," Luke answered. "Just figured no woman and her young'uns should freeze when there's plenty to go around." She wanted to scream that she wasn't helpless, that she didn't need saving, but the words caught in her throat. She looked past him, out into the cold distance, and then back at her children. They were watching, always watching, and she couldn't let them see her crumble. "Thank you, Mr. Callahan," she said finally, forcing calm into her voice. "But we'll manage." Luke didn't argue. He simply nodded once, as though her refusal didn't offend him. Then he stepped forward, set the sack and a bundle of split logs beside the door, and turned to leave. When he reached his horse, he paused and looked back. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "fine folks shouldn't have to lie about being cold." The words struck deeper than he knew. Clara stood frozen, the wind tugging at her shawl, her throat tight. She wanted to call after him, to thank him, to apologize, but pride held her tongue. She watched him ride away, his silhouette swallowed by the drifting snow. When she finally looked down at the sack by her door, tears blurred her vision. Inside were fresh bread, potatoes, jerky, and 2 folded quilts, the kind no one gives to a stranger. For the first time in months, the cold felt a little less cruel. The storm came sooner than expected. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of pewter, and the wind howled through the valley like a living thing. Clara Monroe hurried to patch the cracks in the walls with rags and cloth, but the cold crept in all the same. Snow began to sweep across the plain, white and relentless, erasing every path that led to her door. She knelt by the fire, now burning bright thanks to the wood Luke Callahan had left, and stirred the pot where potatoes simmered. For the first time in weeks, the room smelled of real food. The children huddled nearby, rosy-cheeked and laughing softly as they played with the scraps of string she'd found. She watched them with a mix of relief and guilt. The food had come from him, the warmth too, and every time she looked at the door, she half expected him to return. When the knock finally came, she froze. Luke stood there again, snow clinging to his hat and shoulders, his face roughened by the wind. He looked almost apologetic as he stepped inside, stomping the snow from his boots. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat, "hope I'm not intrudin'. Storm's getting worse. Thought I'd make sure you had enough wood to last the night." "You've done more than enough," Clara said, her tone firmer than she felt. "I don't like owing folks, Mr. Callahan." Luke gave a small nod, glancing toward the children who stared up at him in wonder. "Ain't a debt," he said simply. "Just decency." He set another bundle of wood by the hearth, his large hands working with quiet ease. The firelight caught the edge of his jaw, the faint lines of wear from years spent under the sun. There was nothing pitying in his gaze, only steady, patient respect. After a moment of silence, he turned to her. "How long you been out here alone?" "Since the spring," she said. "Since Jack—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "Since he passed," Luke nodded, eyes softening. "He worked the drive, didn't he? I heard he was a good man." "The best," she whispered. "He'd hate to see us like this." Luke studied her a moment, then glanced around the shack, the leaky roof, the patched windows, the bare shelves. When his gaze returned to hers, it was full of quiet resolve. "You can't stay here no more, ma'am." "Not with winter closing in?" Clara stiffened. "We'll manage," he shook his head. "No, ma'am. You won't. This place won't hold another storm. You and the little ones need a roof that won't fall in on you." Her pride flared again, but this time she heard no judgment in his words, just fact and care. "And what would you have me do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Luke took off his hat, his voice low and even. "Get your things," he said. "You're coming home." The words hit her like a gust of wind. For a long moment, the only sound was the fire crackling between them. "Home?" she repeated, almost laughing from disbelief. "I got a spare room at the ranch," he explained. "Mrs. Hensley runs the kitchen. I could use a hand with the cooking. You'd be working, not begging. The kids'd have warm beds, and you'd earn your keep honest." Clara's eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. "People will talk," she said. "A widow living under a man's roof." Luke's jaw tightened. "Let 'em talk. Folks always do. Don't change what's right." For a long time, she said nothing. Then, with a quiet, shaky breath, she whispered, "Why me, Mr. Callahan?" He looked at her steady and sure. Because no one should have to fight the world alone. He didn't press further, just left the wood, tipped his hat, and stepped out into the storm. Clara stood in the doorway, the snow swirling around him, his figure fading into the white. And for the first time since her husband's death, she let herself believe there might still be good men left in the world. All that night, Clara didn't sleep. The fire burned low, the storm raged outside, and the words Luke Callahan had spoken, "Get your things, you're coming home," echoed in her mind like a haunting melody she couldn't quiet. She sat by the window, watching the snow swirl under the moonlight, wondering what kind of man made such an offer to a woman he barely knew. She told herself it was charity, nothing more. He pitied her, just like the others had before they'd turned away. And yet, there had been no pity in his eyes, only a kind of steady certainty, as if helping her wasn't an act of kindness, but of principle. When morning came, the storm had passed. The valley lay under a blanket of white so pure it hurt to look at. The shack creaked in the cold, and frost glistened on the inside of the windows. Clara stirred the ashes in the hearth and tried to think of what to tell the children. They'd overheard Luke's words. She'd seen the spark of hope in their eyes. But hope was a dangerous thing. She poured hot water over the last crumbs of bread, making a thin, tasteless broth. The children sat close to the fire, whispering about the rancher, the man with the kind eyes and the strong hands. "Mama," Ella said softly, "if we go with him, will we have warm beds?" Clara froze. "We're not going anywhere," she said, forcing her tone to be firm. "Mr. Callahan meant well, but we don't take charity. We're fine here." Ella lowered her eyes, silent. Tommy coughed, a dry, rattling sound that made Clara's chest tighten. She turned away quickly, hiding her fear behind the same mask she'd worn for months, composure, pride, and the stubborn will that had kept her alive this long. Later that morning, as the sky cleared, she saw a rider approaching once again. Luke was back. He rode up slow, his horse's hooves breaking through the crusted snow, and stopped by her gate. Clara stepped outside before he could dismount. "You shouldn't have come," she said. "Storm's over," Luke replied simply, swinging down from his saddle. "I wanted to make sure you made it through the night." "We did," she said shortly. "You can see that." He nodded, his gaze calm but unyielding. "I can, but I can also see you're running low on wood again." She drew in a sharp breath. "Mr. Callahan, I appreciate what you've done. Truly, but we'll manage." "We always have." Luke studied her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "No one manages forever, ma'am." "Not alone." Something in his tone made her look away. She wrapped her shawl tighter as if it could shield her from the truth of his words. "People in this town already talk about me," she said bitterly. "A widow taking help from a man?" They'd twisted into something wicked. "I won't give them that." Luke's jaw tightened, but his voice remained gentle. "Let 'em talk. You can't eat their words, and they don't keep your children warm. I ain't offering gossip, Mrs. Monroe. I'm offering work, food, and safety." His calmness disarmed her. She wanted to argue, to tell him to leave, but her throat closed around the words. Finally, she whispered, "Why are you doing this?" He looked at her steadily. "Because somebody should have done it sooner." For a long time, neither spoke. Then Luke stepped back, placed his hat on his head, and said, "I won't press you, but if you change your mind, you know the way to my ranch. Mrs. Hensley'll make sure you and the little ones are welcome." He turned and mounted his horse, the leather creaking in the cold silence. Clara watched as he rode off toward the horizon, his figure growing smaller until it disappeared behind the snow-covered hills. Inside the shack, the wind moaned again, colder this time, as if testing the strength of her resolve. Clara sat by the fire, her hands trembling in her lap. She'd refused him. But deep down, beneath her pride and fear, a quiet truth took root. She wasn't sure how much longer she could. The night after Luke Callahan rode away was the longest Clara Monroe could remember. The cold crept back into the shack like a patient enemy, slipping through the cracks and settling into their bones. The firewood he'd left was nearly gone, and the last loaf of bread had been divided into careful pieces. She told the children to sleep close together, wrapped in quilts that smelled faintly of pine smoke and leather. His quilts. But Clara didn't sleep. She sat by the dim embers, staring into the dying glow, her thoughts circling the same questions over and over. Could she really uproot her children and go with a man she hardly knew? What if people in town said terrible things? What if the rancher expected more than kindness in return? And yet, what if he didn't? She thought of his face, quiet, honest, steady, and the way he had looked at her, not with pity, but with respect. She remembered his voice when he said, "You'd be working, not begging." There had been truth in that tone, the kind that left no room for doubt. Still, pride was a stubborn weight in her chest. It had kept her alive when charity could have broken her. It was the only thing she had left of her husband, who'd once told her, "You stand tall, Clara, even when the world wants to see you crawl." But Jack had never imagined her children coughing in a cold shack, or her scraping for firewood while snow buried the world outside. Pride couldn't keep them warm. Pride couldn't feed them. The wind howled through the valley, rattling the windows so hard it sounded like fists pounding to be let in. She drew closer to her sleeping children, brushing a lock of hair from Ella's forehead. The girl stirred but didn't wake, her little hand curling against Clara's. And in that moment, Clara knew. She couldn't ask them to endure another night like this, not when there was a man offering shelter, work, and dignity, not when the chance at survival, at life, was a wagon ride away. When the first gray light of dawn slipped through the frost-rimmed window, Clara rose quietly and began to pack. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if she were performing some sacred ritual. She folded the children's worn clothes, the patchwork quilt she'd sewn years ago, a few keepsakes of Jack's, a pocket knife, a faded photograph. That was all they owned now. Tommy woke first, blinking at her sleepily. "Mama, where we going?" Clara smiled faintly, though her throat ached. "Somewhere warm, sweetheart. Somewhere safe." Ella sat up, rubbing her eyes. When she saw the bundles by the door, she gasped softly. "Did you change your mind?" Clara nodded. "I did." The children dressed quickly, their excitement barely contained beneath their politeness. Clara wrapped them in their coats and scarves, then turned for one last look at the shack. The walls were thin, the roof sagged, and frost clung to the inside of the window panes. It had sheltered them barely, but it had never been home. She whispered, "Thank you," to the empty room, then closed the door behind her. Outside, the sky was a pale wash of gold and silver, the snow glinting under the rising sun. In the distance, a lone figure on horseback appeared along the ridge. It was Luke. He didn't look surprised to see her standing there with her children. He just slowed his horse, his expression unreadable, and then dismounted. "Morning, ma'am," he said softly. Clara met his eyes, the cold biting her cheeks. "We're ready." For a moment, neither moved. Then Luke nodded, a shadow of a smile touching his lips. He helped the children onto the wagon, loaded their meager belongings, and offered his hand to her. When she took it, the warmth of his palm startled her. It felt steady, certain, like something she hadn't known she'd been missing. He tipped his hat, climbed onto the wagon, and flicked the reins. The horses started forward, the sound of their hooves muffled by the snow. Behind them, the shack grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely into the white. Ahead, the sun broke free of the clouds, and for the first time in months, Clara let herself believe there might be something beyond survival. Something like hope. The wagon rattled over the frozen trail for hours, wheels creaking in the cold air. Clara sat beside Luke, her children bundled in the back under quilts. The land stretched wide around them, rolling hills patched with snow, cottonwoods bowed under ice, and a sky so pale it seemed to melt into the earth. She hadn't realized how far his ranch was. Each mile carried her further from fear, but deeper into the unknown. Luke didn't speak much. He guided the horses with quiet confidence, the reins firm in his hands. Every so often he glanced her way, not intrusively, but as if making sure she was all right. His silence wasn't awkward. It was steady, like the rhythm of the trail. Clara, unused to silence that wasn't empty, found herself listening to it. The clop of hooves, the soft snore of her son asleep under the quilt, the sigh of the wind through the trees. Peace was a strange sound after months of struggle. When they crested a low hill, she saw it at last. The Callahan Ranch. It sprawled across the valley like something out of a dream. Wooden fences traced neat lines over the snow, smoke curled gently from a stone chimney, and a barn stood proudly beside a frozen creek. Horses grazed near the paddock, their coats glistening under the pale sun. Everything about it looked alive, warm, and strong, the opposite of the life she'd known for too long. Luke slowed the team as they approached the main house, a two-story structure of weathered wood and wide porches. The front door swung open before they'd even stopped. A woman in her 50s stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron, her face lighting up with surprise and welcome. "Luke Callahan," she called. "You finally brought someone home?" Luke chuckled quietly. "Morning, Aunt May. This here's Mrs. Clara Monroe and her children, Ella and Tommy." Aunt May's eyes softened at once. She came down the steps, her warmth as tangible as the firelight spilling from the house behind her. "Well, bless my heart. You poor things must be frozen through. Come in, come in. I've soup on the stove and biscuits just out of the oven." Tommy didn't need to be asked twice. He bolted toward the door, giggling, while Ella followed more shyly, holding her mother's hand. Clara hesitated a moment, taking in the sight of the porch, the clean windows, the scent of home-cooked food drifting out like an invitation she didn't deserve. Luke noticed her stillness. "You and your young'uns are safe here," he said gently. "Aunt May runs the house. You'll have a room of your own, work if you want it, and meals every day." Clara's lips parted. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why would you do all this for us?" Luke took off his hat, his eyes earnest under the shadow of his brow. "Because once, when my pa died, a widow and her boy gave me a place to stay till I could stand on my own again. Guess it's time I paid that kindness forward." Something in her chest broke open, a mix of relief, disbelief, and gratitude so strong it hurt. She nodded, unable to speak, and followed him inside. The warmth hit her first, the smell of stew, of baking bread, of firewood crackling in the hearth. Aunt May ushered the children to the table, ladling soup into bowls, while Clara stood by the door, her hands trembling. It felt unreal, too good, too generous. Luke met her gaze again. "You're not beholden to me, Mrs. Monroe, not a debt in the world between us. Just make this a home again. That's all I ask." For a long moment she could only look at him, her eyes wet, her breath caught in her throat. Then she nodded slowly. "All right, Mr. Callahan," she whispered. "I'll make it a home." As the sun dipped low behind the hills, painting the valley in gold, the ranch came alive with sound. Children's laughter, the clatter of dishes, the soft murmur of voices. For the first time in months, warmth filled every corner of Clara's world. And for Luke Callahan, watching her by the firelight, something long silent inside him began to stir, a feeling that had nothing to do with kindness and everything to do with hope. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Clara Monroe hadn't known in years, a rhythm that felt like life, returning one quiet moment at a time. The mornings began early, before sunrise. The ranch would stir while frost still clung to the grass, and the world smelled of wood smoke and strong coffee. Luke would be out tending the horses before the first light, and Clara often caught sight of him through the kitchen window. His breath white in the air, his movements sure and measured, as though he and the land spoke the same language. Inside, she found her place easily. Aunt May, despite her sharp tongue and bustling energy, welcomed her with the fierce warmth of a matriarch. "You've got good hands," May said one morning as Clara kneaded bread dough at the counter. "And a good heart, too. Don't hide it behind all that worry," Clara smiled faintly. "Habit, I suppose." "Break it," May replied briskly. "The past has had you long enough. Let this place claim you now." And slowly, it did. The ranch demanded work, feeding the chickens, mending clothes, helping with the meals, but it also gave something back. Peace. The children thrived under the open sky. Ella helped May collect eggs every morning, and Tommy followed Luke everywhere, peppering him with questions about horses and ropes. Luke never seemed to tire of answering. "Mr. Callahan," Tommy said one afternoon, his cheeks smudged with dirt. "You think I could ride one day?" Luke's grin came easy. "I don't think, son. I know." Clara had been standing nearby, watching, and the word son caught her off guard. Luke said it naturally, not thinking, and it landed soft in her heart, like a promise she wasn't ready to name. That evening, as the sky bled into hues of rose and violet, Luke came to the porch where she sat mending a sleeve. He leaned against the rail, quiet for a moment, watching the horizon. "You've done a fine job, Mrs. Monroe," he said finally. "Kids look stronger already. The place feels different with you here." Clara looked up. The thread paused between her fingers. "Different how?" He shrugged, thoughtful. "Feels alive again, like it remembers it's a home, not just a roof." Her breath caught. She looked down quickly, focusing on her sewing. "You're kind to say so." "I'm honest, not kind," he said gently. The silence stretched between them, not cold, not awkward, but full of something neither dared name. The light shifted, catching in her hair, and he looked away first, as though afraid to let his thoughts show. Later that night, Clara stood by the window in her small room, watching the snow drift outside. The ranch was quiet except for the wind and the distant creak of the barn door. She thought of Luke's words, of the steadiness in his voice, the way he always looked at her as though seeing the person she'd been before loss hollowed her out. For months, her life had been about surviving, about keeping her children alive through sheer will. But here, with him, with this place, she felt something dangerous and tender beginning to stir. Hope. It frightened her almost as much as it comforted her. The next morning, she found Luke by the corral, repairing a fence. He looked up when she approached, his smile small but real. "Coffee?" she asked, holding out a tin cup. He took it, their fingers brushing. A spark of warmth passed between them, simple, human, undeniable. "Thank you," he said quietly. She nodded, meeting his gaze for a heartbeat longer than she meant to. "You're welcome." As she turned to go, a light breeze carried the smell of hay and horses, and something like spring beneath the frost. It wasn't love yet, not quite, but the ground was softening, ready for it to grow, and though neither of them said it, both felt it rising like the sun after a long, bitter winter, slow, sure, and beautiful. Winter slowly began to loosen its hold on the valley. The snow melted into silver streams that ran along the fences, and the air carried the scent of damp earth and new beginnings. Life at the Callahan Ranch changed with the season. Calves were born, the fields began to green, and laughter became a daily sound inside the house. For Clara Monroe, each sunrise felt like something sacred. The heavy ache that had once followed her everywhere was fading, replaced by a quiet strength. She still worked hard, mending, cooking, tending, but now her hands moved with purpose rather than desperation. The children were thriving. Ella's cheeks were pink again, and Tommy never went to bed without a story or a new tale about the horses. And Luke Callahan, he was always there. Not hovering, not pushing, just steady as the ground beneath her feet. One afternoon, Clara found him in the pasture, working with a young stallion that bucked and kicked at the reins. Luke's patience never wavered. He spoke to the animal in that calm, gravel-smooth tone of his, guiding instead of forcing, teaching instead of breaking. Clara watched from the fence, her heart unexpectedly full. When the stallion finally calmed, Luke looked up and caught her watching. He smiled, wiping sweat from his brow. "He's a fighter," he said, walking over. "Reminds me of someone else I know." Clara raised an eyebrow. "I hope you're not talking about me." He chuckled softly. "I might be." She tried to hide her smile, but failed. "I've had to be," she said. "The world doesn't leave much room for softness." He nodded, his gaze gentle. "Maybe not, but it sure deserves a little of it now and then." For a moment, the wind fell still, and the world seemed to shrink down to just them. The fence between them barely aligned anymore. Then Ella's voice called from the porch, breaking the spell. "Mama, Aunt May says supper's ready!" Clara turned to go, but Luke's voice stopped her. "Clara." She paused, hand resting on the fence post. He stepped closer, his hat in his hands, his voice quieter now. "You ever think about staying here?" Not as my guest, but as part of this place. Her heart stuttered. Luke, I know, he said quickly, not wanting to trap her. You don't owe me an answer, I've grown used to hearing the sound of your laugh in the kitchen. The way the kids fill this house. It's been empty too long. Clara's eyes softened. This ranch was never empty. You just forgot how to listen to it. He smiled, slow and real. Maybe, but I remember now. The sun dipped lower, bathing the pasture in gold. She looked toward the house, where her children waited, their laughter echoing faintly through the air. Then she looked back at Luke, the man who'd offered her nothing but respect, warmth, and a place to begin again. Her voice was quiet, but sure. I'm not ready for promises, Luke, but I'm ready to stop running. He nodded once, as though that was all he needed to hear. Then stay. That's all I'll ask. And she did. That night, after the dishes were washed and the children tucked in, Clara stepped out onto the porch. The stars hung clear above and the air smelled of spring. Luke sat on the steps, carving a piece of wood with his knife. He looked up when she joined him. Beautiful night, he said. Yes, she whispered. It finally is. They sat in silence, shoulders just close enough to feel the warmth between them. For the first time since her husband's death, Clara felt peace, not the fragile kind born of survival, but the deep, steady kind that comes when you've finally found where you belong. She glanced at Luke and smiled softly. Thank you for bringing us home. He tipped his hat, his eyes kind. Ma'am, you did that yourself. I just showed you the road. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of wild grass and the sound of children's laughter from inside. And in that moment, under a sky stitched with stars, with warmth in her heart and hope in her hands, Clara Monroe finally believed in something she'd thought was lost forever.